The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song in the naval cafeteria at Naval Base Coronado, casting that familiar institutional glow over rows of tables where America's finest gathered for their midday meal. It was just another Tuesday afternoon, the kind that blended seamlessly into the routine of military life, where protocols and hierarchies defined every interaction, every glance, every word spoken. Admiral Richard Caldwell, a decorated SEAL commander with 30 years of service etched into the lines of his weathered face, stood in line with two fellow officers, their white dress uniforms pristine and heavy with the weight of medals that told stories of operations most Americans would never know existed. The Admiral was in good spirits that day. A recent successful operation had concluded without casualties, and he was discussing the finer points of tactical planning with Captain Morrison and Commander Hayes. They moved through the line, trays in hand, joking about the mysterious origins of the cafeteria's meatloaf, when Admiral Caldwell noticed something unusual. At a corner table, partially hidden from the main dining area, sat a man who didn't quite fit the usual pattern. He wore the simple green utility uniform of base maintenance staff, his long hair pulled back neatly but distinctly unmilitary in length, and he ate his meal with a quiet intensity that suggested someone comfortable with solitude. What caught the Admiral's attention more than the man himself was the little girl sitting beside him. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing a bright red t-shirt that stood out like a poppy in a field of military green and white. She was chattering away, her small hands gesturing animatedly as she told her father some story about her day at the base school. The man listened with complete attention, occasionally nodding or offering a soft smile that transformed his rugged features into something gentle and warm. It was a touching scene, incongruous in its domesticity against the backdrop of one of America's most elite military installations. Admiral Caldwell had always prided himself on knowing everyone who mattered on his base, and seeing someone he didn't recognize stirred his curiosity. More than that, there was something about the way the man carried himself, even while sitting still, even while simply eating lunch with his daughter. It was a quality the Admiral had learned to recognize over decades of military service, something in the posture, the awareness, the way the man's eyes periodically scanned the room without seeming to do so at all. It was the mark of someone with training, someone who had been somewhere and done something that became part of their very cellular structure. On impulse, and perhaps with a bit of that swagger that comes from wearing stars on your collar, Admiral Caldwell made a decision that would alter the course of his afternoon and challenge his assumptions in ways he never anticipated. He turned to his fellow officers with a slight smirk and said loud enough to be heard, "Gentlemen, shall we see what our facilities staff is made of?" There was laughter in his voice, the kind of good-natured ribbing that officers sometimes indulge in when they forget that every person in uniform has a story, that every role on a military base is filled by someone who chose to serve. The three officers approached the table where the man and his daughter sat. The little girl noticed them first, her eyes widening as she took in the impressive display of rank and medals. She fell silent mid-sentence, her small hand instinctively reaching for her father's arm. The man looked up calmly, his blue eyes meeting the Admiral's gaze with neither fear nor deference, just a quiet acknowledgement of their presence. He didn't stand, didn't salute, didn't show any of the typical reactions one might expect when a 3-star admiral approaches. He simply waited, one hand still resting protectively near his daughter. Admiral Caldwell, enjoying what he assumed would be a brief and amusing interaction, decided to have a bit of fun. In the military, call signs are sacred things, earned through blood, sweat, and the particular brand of humor that develops among warriors who trust each other with their lives. They're given to pilots, special operators, and elite forces members, never to maintenance staff or support personnel. It was this unwritten rule that made the Admiral's next words seem like such obvious jest. "Son," the Admiral said, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that comes from years of command, "I don't believe we've met. I'm Admiral Caldwell, and these are Captain Morrison and Commander Hayes. We like to know everyone who works on our base." He paused, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Tell me, what's your call sign?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and the Admiral heard Captain Morrison chuckle beside him. It was meant to be funny, a gentle reminder of the hierarchy that governed their world, a way of pointing out that the man before them, despite whatever presence he might have, was ultimately just a janitor pushing a mop around a military base. The Admiral expected embarrassment, perhaps confusion, maybe even a good-natured laugh at the absurdity of the question. What he didn't expect was what happened next. The man's expression didn't change. He didn't smile or frown, didn't show offense or amusement. He simply looked at the Admiral for a long moment, and in that pause, something shifted in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, with an undertone that suggested depths the Admiral was only beginning to perceive. "Lone Eagle, sir." The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Admiral Caldwell's smile froze on his face, his body going rigid as if someone had poured ice water down his spine. The color drained from his weathered cheeks, and his hand, which had been casually resting on his belt, dropped to his side. Captain Morrison and Commander Hayes exchanged confused glances, not understanding why those two simple words had transformed their usually unflappable leader into a statue. The cafeteria noise seemed to fade into the background, and for a moment, it was as if the entire world had contracted to just that small corner table and the four men standing around it. "Lone Eagle," the Admiral repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. His mind was racing through files and briefings, through classified operations and legends that circulated in the quietest corners of the Special Operations community. Lone Eagle wasn't just any call sign. It was a ghost story, a myth, a name that appeared in reports so heavily redacted that sometimes only that call sign remained visible on the page. It belonged to a man who had undertaken operations so dangerous, so politically sensitive, that even acknowledging they had occurred could spark international incidents. The Admiral knew the stories because he had been part of the command structure that had overseen some of those operations, though always at a distance, always through layers of plausible deniability. Lone Eagle had been a special operations legend, a lone wolf operator who took on missions that required complete autonomy, absolute skill, and a willingness to operate in the shadows with no backup, no support, and no recognition. He had been the man they sent when sending a team would be too visible, when the mission was so delicate that only one person could possibly succeed. And then, about 5 years ago, Lone Eagle had simply vanished from all operational rosters. No ceremony, no explanation, just gone. "Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison," the man said quietly, and the Admiral noticed that he still hadn't stood, still kept one hand near his daughter, who was watching the exchange with wide, confused eyes. "Retired. 5 years now." The Admiral felt his fellow officers tense beside him as they began to understand the magnitude of who they were speaking to. Captain Morrison, no relation to the retired commander, had heard enough stories in his own SEAL training to know that Lone Eagle was spoken of in the same hushed tones as the most legendary operators in Special Forces history. Commander Hayes, younger but no less informed, felt his own assumptions crumbling as he reassessed the man before them. "Sir," Admiral Caldwell said, and the shift in tone was unmistakable. He wasn't addressing a subordinate or a civilian employee anymore. He was speaking to a fellow warrior, one whose service had likely exceeded even his own in terms of sheer danger and sacrifice. "I apologize. I didn't. We had no idea you were here on this base." Jake Morrison, Lone Eagle, finally stood, but not out of deference to rank. He rose because his daughter was becoming uncomfortable with the attention, and he gently guided her behind him protectively. "No apology necessary, Admiral. I prefer it this way. Anonymity is safer. For everyone." His eyes flicked meaningfully to his daughter, and the Admiral understood immediately. A man with Jake's history had enemies, organizations and individuals who would love nothing more than to find him, and more importantly, find his vulnerabilities. The little girl, sensing the tension, tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, who are these people?" Her voice was small, uncertain in the way children become when adult conversations turn serious. Jake looked down at her, and the transformation was immediate. The warrior disappeared, replaced by a father whose entire world was contained in that small person looking up at him. "Just some people I used to work with, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." He glanced back at the Admiral. "Sir, if you don't mind, my daughter and I were just finishing lunch before I get back to work." But Admiral Caldwell was not ready to let this moment pass. His military mind was already processing the implications, the questions, the sheer improbability of having one of America's most decorated covert operatives working as a janitor on his base. "Commander Morrison, I think we need to talk. Your office or mine?" It wasn't really a request, though it was phrased politely. Jake hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. "With respect, Admiral, I'm not active duty anymore. I have a job to do and a daughter to care for. Whatever conversation you think we need to have, I assure you it's unnecessary. It's about your clearances, your benefits, your situation," the Admiral pressed, his voice lower now, more private despite the public setting. "A man with your service record shouldn't be." He gestured vaguely at Jake's maintenance uniform, unable to quite voice what he was thinking. "Shouldn't be what, sir? Shouldn't be working an honest job? Shouldn't be spending every day with his daughter?" Jake's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "I left that life for a reason. Several reasons, actually." His hand rested on his daughter's shoulder. "The best reason." The Admiral saw it then, the full picture coming into focus. A single father, raising a daughter alone, choosing the most anonymous, unassuming job he could find on a military base where at least there was familiarity and security. Choosing a life where he could be present, where he could attend school events and eat lunch with his child, rather than disappearing for months at a time into places that didn't exist on any map. It was a choice that spoke volumes about what Jake Morrison valued, about what Lone Eagle had ultimately been fighting for all along. Captain Morrison, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Sir, perhaps this conversation could wait until the commander has finished his lunch and his shift. We could arrange something for later, at his convenience." Admiral Caldwell nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in that suggestion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, extending it to Jake. "Commander, I would very much like to speak with you, not because I want to pull you back into anything, but because I think there are resources and options you might not be aware of. Things that could help you and your daughter. No obligations, no strings. Just a conversation between two men who've served their country." Jake looked at the card for a long moment before taking it. "I'll think about it, sir." As the three officers began to walk away, the Admiral paused and turned back. "Commander, for what it's worth, thank you. For your service, for your sacrifices, and for reminding an old admiral that sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is choose to be a father first." The story of that encounter spread through the base in the way such stories do, whispered in ready rooms and rec centers, embellished and mythologized with each retelling. But for those who were there, who witnessed the moment when Admiral Caldwell's joke turned into something profound, it became a reminder that every person has a story, that valor and heroism take many forms, and that sometimes the most impressive uniform is the one worn by a single dad choosing to be present for his child. Lone Eagle had indeed earned his call sign through countless dangerous missions, but perhaps his greatest operation was the one he conducted every single day, raising his daughter with love and dedication in a world that would never fully know what he had sacrificed for its safety.